The tragedy of Jallianwala Bagh in 1919 is a shameful scar on British Indian history. As Her Majesty the Queen said, it is a distressing example of our past history with India. We deeply regret what happened and the suffering caused.
Well, joining me now is Priyamvada Gopal. She's a lecturer in postcolonial theory at Cambridge University and the author of Literary Radicalism in India, Gender, Nation and the Transition to Independence. And in Victoria, Canada is Rachna Singh. She's a Canadian politician and Legislative Assembly member for the British Columbia New Democratic Party. And back with us from Aberdeen, Scotland is Tom Bentley. He's the author of Empires of Remorse, Narrative, Postcolonialism and Apologies for Colonial Atrocity. Good to have you, Priyamvada and Rachna, join the program. Rachna, let me begin with you. So the action was horrendous 100 years ago. It was a massacre. General Dyer was, or Colonel Dyer was terrible in his actions, and the people who defended him, they were terrible. But why do you think the British government, despite all of this evidence, and despite the fact that they've said, yes, it was bad, why do you think they've fallen short of a formal apology?
I can go with the examples that Canada has set. We had during the colonial rule, we had some bad things happening in Canada as well. One of them, which is very well known, is the Kamagata Maru incident. And it happened more than 100 years ago too. But the Canadian government in Parliament formally apologized for it. It has, we cannot change the past, but it has helped us rewrite the colonial, decolonize our history. So I would expect a similar thing from the British Parliament. I don't know what is stopping them. They can take the examples from Canada, which is a country very similar to Britain. I don't know what is holding them back. Right. I can't make that.
Priyamvada, so Theresa May saying it's a shameful scar on Britain's history in India. David Cameron before her and others said, yes, it was bad, but they're not saying sorry. To what do you attribute that?
Well, I think there are two things that are going on. Partly, I think there is a concern about the link between saying sorry and paying reparations. We know that Tony Blair was very reluctant to say sorry for slavery because he worried about reparations. We also know that in the relationship between Haiti and France, France has apologized for its role in criminal slavery, and that opened up a whole discussion about reparations. But I think also that there is a question about what an apology means. And Theresa May this morning, or yesterday rather, expressed regret about a shameful episode in British history. But really, if you think about it, Amritsar was not an isolated incident. Colonialism was a violent enterprise from start to very slow and painful finish. And I have questions about whether it makes sense to apologize for a single incident and pretend, as many in Britain have, that it was an isolated incident of violence that was due to one bad apple, General Dyer in this instance. What we know is that Amritsar was one episode amongst many in which any resistance to empire was violently quashed. And violence was not at all unknown to the British Raj. Certainly by 1919, it was being used very regularly in all kinds of ways. So what I would say is that, well, it's interesting that Theresa May has expressed regret, but I think if you're going to express regret, then you need to be expressing regret for the system of violence that ran across half the globe and ran across 2 centuries. Colonialism was a violent enterprise.
So, Tom, were these strategically chosen words by saying it was a shameful episode? Because it then looks at Amritsar as an aberration rather than something that was nested in a couple of 100 years of an aberration of British colonialism.
Yeah, there's absolutely no doubt that these were very strategically chosen words. Every apology is strategically chosen in terms of its words, because one of the things about state apologies is perhaps like interpersonal apologies, where they can be more spontaneous. In state apologies, you get to script them, you get to write them, you have your advisors, you have your lawyers, you'll discuss it in cabinet beforehand. So clearly these are strategically chosen words. They're words that don't actively accept the way in which the atrocity was couched within the larger confines of empire. They don't actively acknowledge the specific role of the state in the violence it committed. Obviously, of course, talking about a shameful event or a scar is also a euphemism as well, which avoids legal responsibility. So these words are not plucked out of thin air.
Okay, so Rachna, after you've heard Tom and Priyamvada say that one of the things could be politically, they fear that this would open up a Pandora's box, and that, as horrendous as this might sound, that when you apologize for a genocide, for example, you can say sorry because there's nobody left to pay because you killed everybody if you were an empire in the past, right? But if you're apologizing for hundreds of years of colonialism and you have descendants and people who were affected by that colonialism, well, these politicians are fearful that it's going to hit their pocketbooks as well. Do you understand that political thinking, Rachna?
Kamagata-Maru, we definitely have. I can give example of Kamagata-Maru again. We do have descendants here in Canada who were advocating for apology, but nothing more than apology. It was not something that we were able to accomplish in a day. It took years for the organizations, for the family members to ask for that. But I think when the government decided to make the apology, it was made clear. I think that it would be just the apology, not any monetary compensation associated with it. I think that made it a little easier. But we had another incident here, which is known as Chinese head tax. And in that case, the government decided to compensate the survivors because there were still survivors for that incident. Right. So they decided to do that. So I think it depends on the incident and how humiliating it has been for the generations, for the society. I think they make the decision accordingly. But we have both examples here in Canada, the way the government has handled it.
Priyamvada, so healthy, vibrant debate within the House of Commons. Jeremy Corbyn's Labour pushing for a full apology. Is it just because they're the opposition and that's what the opposition does, or are they, doing something really useful here, pushing something that might, come to fruition sometime soon?
Well, I think that I can't say, why they're doing it. I think it is fair to say that elements in the Labour Party have been critical of the imperial project. Corbyn himself in the past has been deeply critical of slavery and has called for Britain to acknowledge its full role in that enterprise. So I'm not going to impute motivations to why people might be calling for apologies or not. I think there are people in Britain, and there have historically been people in Britain who have been critical of the project of empire. I've just finished writing a book about it. And so I think that there are elements in the Labour Party who are genuinely engaged with the question of what happened during empire and the question both of apologies and indeed of reparations. My view is that we should in fact be having a discussion about reparations. It would be different in different contexts. I find Rachna's examples really interesting. The Kamagata-Maru, for instance. Again, it's a fairly contained, limited episode, which would in any case not have very huge financial implications. The real dispossessed in Canada, which are the First Nations, people whose land was taken from them, people who were ethnically cleansed. At that point, you start to have a much more complicated discussion. And although, yes, Canada has made greater strides than America in acknowledging what happened with the First Nations, I think Canada, like the other white settler colonies, has a very long way to go in terms of explaining their own emergence out of land grabbing, dispossession, genocide, corralling people into reservations. I'm not really seeing that discussion happen in any great length or depth in Canada. And there, the question of reparations, I think, would be much more painful than in the case of the Komagata Maru. So I do think that the question of reparations, particularly in relation to slavery, needs to be brought back on the table. And one other thing, you don't have to have an apology in order to be made to pay reparations. We know that the survivors of torture by the British in the Mau Mau camps in Kenya did successfully bring a case that was fought in the British courts.
Yes.
So individual survivors of violence or legatees of violence can bring a case anyway, regardless of whether there's a state apology or not.
Yes. Yeah, that's a good point. You can just go to the courts without getting a state apology. Rachna, I want you to address the one point before I go to Tom for a final answer. Rachna, the examples you gave, the examples you gave were sort of low-hanging fruit for Canada. Much more difficult if you want to talk about proper apologies and reparations for First Nations. Address that, Rachna.
Totally, I totally agree with that. We have a history of, we are on the indigenous lands, and what they have gone through under this state, it's simply not, an apology is not enough. But in the recent years, what we have seen is that the governments have started acknowledging those. I think that is the first step towards making any kind of, to start any kind of healing process for the First Nations. 100 years of systemic discrimination, racism that they went through. But now, I didn't see it before, but for the last 10 years, and it is different governments. And I can say about our provincial government and the federal government, both making amends, both making inroads for that to happen. We are not there yet, but it is a process that they have started.
Okay. So, Tom, very finally, I guess if I walk, and you can disagree with me, if I walk down the streets of Aberdeen and I discuss colonialism, a lot of people would say, well, it was actually English colonialism and not British colonialism, and they might make a distinction between Scots and English as we discussed it. But looking at all of the UK, can we say by the year 2019, where we are right now in April, that the UK has reconciled with its colonial past?
Well, that's extremely interesting that you mentioned the Scotland example, but I think maybe an even more prominent example might be in regards to Northern Ireland,
right?
Well, where there'll be a considerable number of people who will consider that they are still colonised by Britain. So this creates enormously difficult philosophical discussions about apology. When a government apologises, who are they apologising on behalf? Are they apologising on behalf of all the citizens? What about citizens in Northern Ireland that don't accept themselves to be British? What about citizens with different heritages from colonised countries? Should they be both sorry and be apologised to? So you get all these thorny questions when it comes to apologies.
Okay, Tom, Priyamvada and Rachna, it's been fascinating talking to all of you. I really appreciate you all taking the time to join us here on The Newsmakers.